This is True Criminals.
UK policing has a tremendous record of solving homicide, but it doesn't have a tremendous record of solving the most complex of cases. And all of the cases in Trident, because they're gangland hits, because sometimes there's no real connection between killers and their victims, they're what's called Category A murders, i.e. the most complex type to solve. So we don't have a 9 out of 10 conviction rate. And the time I joined, it was only 1 in 5.
I'm journalist Helen Foss-Barrow.
I'm crime reporter Martin Brunt.
And this is True Criminals.
A journey into the darkest corners of the criminal underworld with insights from decades of true crime reporting.
The stories behind the stories, plus exclusive interviews with those closely involved in notorious cases.
Re-examining crimes so shocking, they still haunt our imaginations.
Just after midnight on Sunday, the 14th of September 2003, in a cramped North London bedsit, 7-year-old Toni-Ann Byfield was murdered, shot in the back in her pyjamas. The man she thought of as her father had been murdered in front of her, and Toni-Ann became what detectives later called collateral damage, an innocent child caught up in a violent drugs war.
This case horrified everyone who heard about it, including detectives on the case. It's true that black London gang warfare didn't attract the headlines that other serious crime did, but the murder of a young schoolgirl, caught in the crossfire or deliberately targeted, was different.
In this double episode, we're piecing together what happened and taking you deep inside the investigation with the man who led it, former Assistant Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, Neil Basu. We'll explore the pressure, the challenges and the early break that didn't hold up. Martin, can we just start by asking what you remember of this case?
Not as much as I might have done in different circumstances. The murders came at a very busy time for crime reporters. I mean, the previous year, 2002, we'd had the murders of Soham schoolgirls Holly and Jessica. The Millie Dowler murder was still unsolved at that point. And in early this year, 2003, we had 2 teenage girls shot dead in a drive-by shooting in Birmingham. And a special needs teacher, Jane Longhurst, was murdered in Brighton. So I was busy. But the impact of Toni-Ann's murder was huge. And whatever the gunman's thinking in killing her, it was savage, it was callous, it was incredibly sad. And it wasn't typical of the kind of violence that we'd seen in drugs gang violence.
Before we get to that cramped bedsit in the early hours in 2003 and hear more of what actually happened, tell me a little bit about Toni-Ann, the 7-year-old, and what kind of life she was leading, Martin.
She was born in Jamaica and she came to the UK as a small child. By the time of the murder, she was officially in the care of Birmingham City Council's social services. But in reality, she was being moved between various adults and at one time a so-called aunt.
So passed really from pillar to post. Toni-Ann wasn't growing up in a very stable environment, was she?
She wasn't, and that's how she ended up in London in the first place. Temporary arrangement, holiday cover. She was basically a little girl being passed around.
And that opened the door to Bertram Byfield, a man who she looked upon and thought of as her father. How did that come about?
Well, Byfield had a record for drug dealing. Crack cocaine, and was known in the streets by the nickname Blacker. He was living in a hostel-style bedsit in the Harrow Road area of Brent, North London, the kind of place where residents and visitors come and go at all hours.
And Toni-Ann thought that this man was her real father.
He wasn't her biological father, but she thought he was her dad. And on Saturday, 13th of September 2003, he took her out for the day to Brent Cross Shopping Centre. They went shopping for a school uniform. And CCTV shows them looking frankly like any other parent and child, walking side by side, holding hands.
And she was excited about going to school, wasn't she?
She was. She was going to school within a few days of her murder. People who saw her that day described a very happy, chatty girl talking about making new friends, looking forward to going to school and learning new things.
And what happened that fateful night?
Late, around 11 p.m, they headed back to Byfield cramped bedsit. And after midnight, the early hours of that Sunday morning, a man turned up, and residents in the hostel reported hearing a scream. Perhaps it was Toni-Ann, perhaps it was Byfield himself when he was shot. Then a disturbance, then multiple shots. At the trial later, the police version is that Bertram Byfield was shot first, and then Toni-Ann was shot once in the back as she tried to either run away or try to hide.
It's so difficult to imagine, isn't it, Martin? A little girl in her pyjamas, awake in the early hours, witnessing whatever went on, and then being shot in the back in a doorway. It's quite hard to get your head around.
Only the gunman really knows why she was shot, but the prosecution case at the trial was that she was shot simply because she was a witness. She had seen the face of the killer, and he couldn't allow her to stay alive and perhaps point him out.
We're joined by the former Assistant Commissioner of the Met Police, Neil Basu, who was the senior investigating officer on this case for the gun crime unit Operation Trident, and wrote a moving account about it in his memoir, Turmoil, which has actually just come out in paperback. Neil also co-hosts the Crime Agents podcast. Neil, it's great to have you back on True Criminals.
Well, thanks for having me back.
Good to see you, Neil, on a very different subject. Let's start with this. When did you first hear the names Toni-Ann and Bertram Byfield?
Well, it would have been the evening after the murder. Bear in mind that the murders happened virtually on the stroke of midnight. So by sort of about 16 hours later, I got a call middle of the night saying, "This has happened, you're in the frame, can you be at Hendon for a briefing in the morning?" And from the team that was on overnight and had taken the job. And of course that was what they called back then one of the regular murder squads, who had been, you're either on call or in frame, which means you're either on duty in the middle of the night expecting a call to come in, and your job is to go out there and, well, your job is to try and solve it from minute one. But if you can't do that, you have to make sure everything is done in preparation for the in-frame team, which is the team that has the resources and capacity to take on a new murder, who will be handed that job in the morning. And that was effectively the role I was going to play, much to the upset of the regular murder squad who thought they'd solved it. But the only reason for that is we were Operation Trident, and because it was, well, particularly 7-year-old Toni-Ann, which was absolutely horrendous, tragic, heartbreaking story, and her father, and they were members of the black community in Harlesden, Trident naturally expected to pick up jobs like that, and the community that had invested quite a lot of faith in Operation Trident would have wanted Trident to do it. So I imagine I wasn't part of the meetings then. I wasn't senior then. I was a detective chief inspector. I was a senior officer, but I was an investigator. I was an operator, not a management board person. But what I know now is they would have been sitting around the management board table saying, what are the optics of this? Who should be investigating it? They would have come to the conclusion Trident, and I was the in-frame Trident senior investigating officer.
Just picking up on what you said there, Neil, they thought they'd solved it. Can you explain that to us, and then obviously explain to us a bit about what Operation Trident was and what you were trying to achieve?
Well, the first part is they had a prime suspect. Tony Byfield, in his earlier life, had been quite a hard local drug dealer.
This is Bertram Byfield, known as...
Bertram Byfield, known as Tony Byfield. Bertram Byfield was, yes, a very hard man, and quite a, not notorious, just a very well-known person in the area of northwest London and Brent. But his previous upbringing had been in and amongst some very, very serious organised criminals. But he wasn't doing that. He was recently released from prison. He was effectively trying to get his business back up and running. His business was dealing relatively small amounts of drugs, which made him a target for other drug dealers. But also, and that when you're looking at any murder, you're looking at victimology, which is basically the study of the victim and their lifestyle and everything you could possibly know about the victim, because you are trying to use that to get an insight into who would have the motive, the means and the opportunity to kill them. So when you're looking at him, the original murder squad, one of the first things they would have done is get an intelligence analyst to look at the background of Bertram. And immediately what flags up is, well, he had been a victim of a very serious crime in which he was GBH'd. He was actually shot by an individual. The argument was not about drugs. It was about a girl. So this man had taken his partner, fathered a child with that person, and while that person was in jail, Bertram had got back together with the partner, and they'd had a dispute basically over this woman. A dispute that turned into deadly violence, and it ended up being a court case of this man's word against Bertram about who had assaulted who and who was guilty. It collapsed on the basis of neither of them being very credible witnesses against each other. So effectively, both Bertram and this other individual were out and about in the streets of northwest London with a mortal hatred for each other. Well, when Bertram gets killed, I mean, clearly, the prime suspect is going to be that other person. They'd done all of that research, they had a file on him, and they were preparing to arrest him. And that's the package that was handed over to me some 16 or so hours later.
As Operation Trident. So where does Trident fit into that? What did Trident do, Neil?
Well, I know you've covered Trident on True Criminals in the past, but just a very brief history of Trident. Trident was formed in 1998. It was formed as a unit that was investigating what was quite clumsily titled then, I don't think the black community appreciate this so much today, black on black crime. But actually the reason it was called that was the black community had seen within its community a lot of very hardened criminals coming in, and what they were doing was mostly dealing drugs. There was a crack epidemic that we'd imported from the United States and the Caribbean into the UK, and we had a lot of criminals from that part of the world who had been chased out of their home turf by some very aggressive and assertive American and Caribbean policing, and had found easier places to ply their trade, one of them being the United Kingdom. So they'd kind of infiltrated these communities, and they were teaching young black British boys how to be violent drug dealers. And the corollary of that was a massive increase in murders, mostly by gun, a lot of shootings, and nightly reports of shootings. So it was getting pretty desperate. And that Operation Trident was formed to try and stop that happening. And it was formed with a very, very small unit, which was a kind of community relations team, to try and win the confidence of the black community to help us solve those crimes. And the reason for that was the black community for years felt that they had been massively over-policed and under-protected, particularly by the Metropolitan Police Service. You can go right back to histories of riots. You can go back as far as the 50s, but the early 80s were the famous time of the Operation Swamp Initiative, the sus law, the stop and searching of young black British boys and young black British men. And that had caused an uprising in Brixton at that time. I was a former Brixton officer. When I was a detective sergeant in Brixton in the mid-1990s, I was, briefing a lot of intelligence into the role and responsibilities of young black boys being drawn into serious crime. And the community wanted that to stop. They didn't want these people being seen as heroes in the community and to their youngsters. So they wanted the Metropolitan Police to do something about it. So they actually came to us and said, look, if you want to police with us, you need to put more resource into this. But the actual 1998 murder of a woman called Avril Johnson in front of her children, which was a robbery by an organised gang of black men who were going robbing people in the community, was so horrific that there was so much pressure on the Metropolitan Police to do something about that crime. A squad was formed to deal with that one particular crime. So from that kernel of 12 to 16 proactive officers going after that robbery team, Trident was formed. And of course it was right on the cusp of the Macpherson Report into the Met. So the fact that the Met was being accused of institutional racism and the biggest trust and confidence deficit was in the black community meant resources would be poured into Trident. By the time I joined Trident, it was already a couple of hundred strong. They'd had 2 murder squads as well as all the proactive units chasing organised criminals around, gangsters for want of a better term. But the two murder squads that were in existence, one north and one south, were utterly overwhelmed. The senior investigating officers had between them probably well over 150 investigations, which would be shootings, attempted murders and murders. There's no way that two senior investigating officers and two equivalent murder teams could cope with all of that crime. So I set up the third murder squad in northwest London, and a fourth was set up in South London, and eventually between the four of us we began over many years to try and get that level of violence under control. But that's what Trident was, that's how it was formed, and that's how it got more resource. And really, it's one of the untold legacies of the Stephen Lawrence inquiry and the racist murder of Stephen back in 1993.
You've preempted some of my next question.
I always do that, Martin, don't I? I'm sorry.
This was 4 years after that damning Macpherson report into what went wrong in the Met's investigation into the murder of Stephen Lawrence, and that accusation of institutional racism that was put on the force. So here you are, a black officer investigating black gang violence, a community that doesn't trust the police, the worst possible murder of a young child. What kind of pressure were you under to solve it?
Well, just as a quick aside, I'm not a black officer. I'm mixed race, Asian and British white. So, and I say that because my friends in the black community call me their cousin, because they can't call me their brother because I'm not black, but they call me their cousin because I understand, and I do understand what it feels like to be different in a majority white culture, and how difficult it is to be heard, and how difficult it is to feel that you're getting the same kind of support from the state. So there were two forms of pressure. One is exactly as you've described. I eventually retired as the most senior officer of colour in Britain. So when you're dealing with crimes that have a racial element or are seen as hate crimes against a community, and whether it was my years in terrorism with anti-Muslim hatred and anti-Semitism on the rise, with borough commander in Barnet with the largest Jewish community outside of an American city, and rising anti-Semitism, you kind of know how it feels if you're different and your voice isn't being heard. And I never wanted to be the police officer or the senior investigating officer where the community or the family or the bereaved didn't feel that they were going to get the very best of service from the police. So there's a pressure to get it absolutely right from that. And the second pressure is it was one of the most notorious crimes, because Toni-Ann was so young. It was one of the most notorious crimes of that year and was certainly front page news. And because Toni-Ann's family spread far and wide, from Caribbean to the United States, and in this country, Birmingham and London, and lots of associations, it was very well covered internationally. And that brings its own added pressure that every senior investigating officer you will interview will tell you what it feels like to be on the front page of every newspaper with. And these days it's 100 times worse than back in 2003, because almost everyone is an armchair detective and they are bombarding you on social media with effectively their theories and their investigative lines of inquiry, and they know nothing, but it doesn't stop them. And that's very, very distracting.
Do police officers read that stuff?
I think some do. I mean, there's a reason why I have no social media presence whatsoever. I spent my career, as social media took off post 10 years after this, really, telling people who were being bombarded by messages like that, don't read it. And if you can, get off it, because it will be much safer for your mental health. And the minute you start engaging with anyone like that, they don't stop. That's the pattern. Very few will ever take what they're saying to you online into the real world. Very few. It's a tiny percentage. Doesn't mean it won't happen, but mostly it's about your own health. The trouble is lots of people, politicians particularly, so there was a big thing with MPs post-Brexit, getting an awful lot of trolling and hatred and some really despicable stuff. It's very hard if you have to be online because you're a public person. It's very hard to take that advice. I took my own advice. So I have to this day read a handful of comments. I was sort of used to the old-fashioned green ink postbag landing at New Scotland Yard with plenty of death threats and abuse, but I never saw it online.
You had plenty of that in television as well, the
bet
ones
you do,
that the press office would hide away from you.
I was going to say celebrities are the other, you have no choice, your living is, so whether you're whether you consider yourself a celebrity or not, the minute you're on TV regularly, you know as well as I do, you are a celebrity and you get bombarded.
I digress, but I had a life-size model of me made out of straw sent to one television organisation.
Just bizarre, isn't it?
I know. Take us back, if you can, Neil, to when you found out about what had happened to Toni-Ann and the crime scene, the bedsit. Will you sort of talk us through your involvement in those early hours of the investigation?
Well, I mean, almost the first thing, once you've had the briefing and you've briefed your team and you've got, because bear in mind, a murder team will be somewhere between 40 and 45 officers. You'll have a team running the major incident room. You'll have 4 investigative teams. You'll have an intelligence unit. And this was the Trident setup. So 40 to 45 officers have to be brought up to speed with everything that the on-call team has put together. Once you've got that, the first thing you're going to want to do is visit the scene. So I had a detective sergeant many years ago said, the best thing you can do, Neil, is give your eyes a treat. You know, it's a proper kind of old-fashioned 1970s Life on Mars detective sergeant. But he was absolutely right. You've got to go and have a look at the scene for yourself. And the reason you're doing that is you're trying to put your mind in the mind of the killer and understand what their movements would have been, where the bodies were situated, what the crime scene looks like. Sounds macabre, but you're obviously, you're trying to sort out in your head where the best opportunities to advance the investigation are. Now, you've got professional members of your team out checking for closed-circuit television, doing house-to-house inquiries, making sure that anybody who heard anything or saw anything are being spoken to. So that's coming in at the same time. You have to visit the family and make sure the family understand that you're going to treat their case seriously. So I had to do that. The first thing to do is make sure that you never promise you're going to solve this case. I think one of the worst things we do is we overpromise and underdeliver. You must never do that. You never know whether you're going to solve the case at the start or not, despite the fact that UK policing has a tremendous record of solving homicide, but it doesn't have a tremendous record of solving the most complex of cases. And all of the cases in Trident, because they're gangland hits, because sometimes there's no real connection between killers and their victims, they're what's called Category A murders, i.e. the most complex type to solve. So we don't have a 9 out of 10 conviction rate. And the time I joined, it was only 1 in 5. So you go to this scene, and sometimes crime scenes, I had one crime scene once, which was the entire length of the A1 that gridlocked the M1 when I closed the scene down to do the forensics. And the Prime Minister's office got a call and the Mayor's office called the Commissioner, and I got it in the ear for what I thought I was doing. But what I was doing was preserving a crime scene for forensic opportunity. Now, in this case, it was a bedsit. It was a bedsit off Kensal Rise, off the Harrow Road. So it was not going to interfere with anyone if we closed that scene down and kept it for as long as we possibly could. And we did. But bear in mind, it's a bedsit. So it's literally one room, one bathroom, one front door, one communal front door. I can't tell you how many tens of thousands of pounds. At one point, my commander, who at the time was Cressida Dick, made jokes about me trying to bankrupt the Met on a single inquiry. But I spent a fortune trying to get forensic evidence and trying to find forensic evidence in that bedsit, and we got nothing. We had a couple of partial prints and a bit of partial DNA that never came back to anything on the national databases. So whether they belong to, bear in mind that Bertram was a drug dealer and people were buying from him at that bedsit. They could have been anyone, but they weren't showing with anyone. So until we had a suspect that we could match with those unrecognised prints or DNA samples, we had nothing. So there was nothing obvious, and you would think in that close proximity there would be something obvious. What was likely to be obvious was the shooter themselves would have been covered in firearms residue, probably blood splatter. Their clothes would have been contaminated. We could have had their shoes for comparison to prints in and out of the flat. We could have placed the killer in the flat if you catch them quickly. In this case, I'm getting the crime 16 hours later and there's no suspect. No one has seen anything. One person has heard shrill, high-pitched female screaming, so we think there's either a female at the scene. It sounded like an adult, so they weren't saying it was Toni-Ann. I strongly suspect with hindsight, because of the injuries that Bertram Byfield suffered, one of which was a bullet to the groin, that it could have been him screaming, sounding like a high-pitched female. There was certainly never any female witness to the murders that ever, and we interviewed many, many people who were called persons of interest. So they might have been witnesses, they might have been suspects, but it wasn't that. So you've got nothing. There was no definitive CCTV. There was traffic passing in the main road, but the CCTV in those days was nowhere near enough quality to even, well, certainly not to get a registration plate. Not even to be absolutely definitive on make and model of car. And the one make and model of car we got was one of the most popular in Britain. So, saying there was a potentially slightly dark coloured VW Golf in the vicinity at the time, narrow that down. Tens of thousands, not helpful at all. So literally we had nothing other than a potential motive from this prime suspect. And very, very quickly my team had this person in custody.
And you've described him, this man in custody who looked like a good fit for the murder, as being very relaxed, almost calm, which was a bit odd.
Richard Davis, who rang me up, the brilliant detective sergeant, who my wife always jokes, whenever I've struggled to solve anything, she says, well, you need to give Richard a ring because he solved all your crimes for you. I hope he's listening because he was brilliant. And in many ways, these two chapters in the book are sort of dedicated to Richard and the detective sergeants like him who did all of the hard frontline work. And when he rang me up, he said, well, he's in custody, but he looks very relaxed. I can't remember the exact phrase he used. It's in the book. But and I thought, well, that's not good news. I mean, nobody who's been arrested for a double murder looks relaxed. People who are innocent and know they're innocent and know they can prove their innocence look relaxed. Either that or they're sociopaths. Now, someone who's killed a 7-year-old in cold blood is probably the most horrific murder that I dealt with in my career. Probably must be on the verge of being a sociopath, so you never know. You never know that it's not. And the point is, you should never go into any murder investigation absolutely convinced that you've got everything nailed down right at the start. Everything is a hypothesis. Everything is a theory until you've proved or disproved it. So here we have a suspect. We're going to interview them. We're going to try and alibi him. Then we're going to try and break his alibi. We're going to try and match all of his forensics with anything we've got outstanding from the scene. It's all looking good. So we're all thinking this is good. And Richard's describing, the guy's sitting there, and when we turn up at the station, you can see he smokes. I'm a smoker. There's no big deal about that. He smokes a particular brand of cigarette, B&H Gold, and as he's taking a cigarette out of the packet, he breaks it in half and puts the other half back in the packet. Now, by that time, I'd been a smoker for 20 years. I'd never done that with a cigarette. Maybe my job was a little more useful in terms of revenue, and I could afford to buy new packets rather than trying to save in that way. Somebody described it as quite a common thing to me, but I'd certainly not seen it before. I'd dealt with hundreds of criminals and I'd been with hundreds of smokers in my time, so it looked like an unusual thing to me. What was most damning about it, which is why Richard and I were looking at each other, slightly pleased with ourselves, is that outside the crime scene on the pavement, so not in the scene itself, but very close proximity to a murder scene, was a packet of B&H with a half broken stub inside. So you've got to think to yourself, is that his? So trying to connect him to that packet and then connect his DNA imprints to the scene was the holy grail of that investigation. And bear in mind, we're in the first 2 days of an investigation. If we solve it that quickly, and it's one of the most notorious in the UK, that would be massive for Trident. And let's be honest, there's a bit of me as a young senior investigating officer in the Met, the youngest in the Met at the time, thinking this is going to make my career as well. The family are going to love us, the community is going to love us, my bosses are going to love me, and things will look very rosy from here on in.
That's great circumstantial evidence, but of course that fag packet didn't have any DNA.
No.
Or fingerprints from your suspect.
No.
You said in your book that he wasn't very helpful to you. I mean, why would he be helpful? You've nicked him for something he didn't do. Why'd you expect him to be helpful?
Yeah, I think perhaps I was being a bit naive that he'd want to exonerate himself from the potential double murder charge. And let's be honest, the black community didn't see us as particularly, knights in shining armour with the highest of integrity. I think mostly they think we're going to fit them up. So I thought he would have been incredibly nervous about sitting in a police station being interviewed by Trident, which had a pretty solid reputation in the community as being a pretty hard unit to come across. Along with the flying squad, we were probably the two feared units in the Met. So you thought at that point he'd say everything he possibly could to get out of this particular allegation. Instead, he said nothing. And, the alibi he gave, which was effectively his baby mother sitting at home in her flat, should have been very easy to stand up. And of course, his baby mother was busy corroborating that alibi. So we're thinking, okay, but that's an easy alibi to make. It should be a relatively easy one to break. It turned out that was not the case. So effectively, because he lied about his movements on the night of the murder, we spent 3 weeks tracking his movements throughout London, effectively door to door for witnesses, using electronic surveillance to get a CCTV image, which was a partial image, but was good enough to 100% identify him and his vehicle, trading something on the forecourt of a petrol station miles and miles away from the scene at the time the murder happened. So it isn't him. And of course, it's very close to another girlfriend he's got unknown to his baby mother, where he was having an illicit relationship. And I say that because she was 15. I don't know whether her father knew that or not. But of course, what he was looking at was a statutory rape allegation and potential investigation and potential drug dealing, but neither of which were likely to be proven. She was unlikely to make an allegation of rape against him. The father might have done, but I suspect not. And the drug dealing would have been impossible to prove. It's just CCTV of somebody exchanging something on a forecourt. So he really had nothing to lose by saying, no, I don't know what you're talking about. I was on, but I think he was, why he would have been worried with his criminal background of either of those two allegations compared to the allegations of a double murder remains beyond me today. But
how did that impact the investigation then? Because it delayed you a lot, didn't it? It took quite a few weeks to completely rule him out of your Toni-Ann Byfield investigation.
That's not how the judge at his and his baby mother's trial found it, because they were acquitted for perverting the course of justice.
Were they?
And they were saying effectively, what the judge was saying was, bear in mind I had to get this through a senior Crown Prosecution Service lawyer to get the indictment in the first place. So we thought it was a cut and dried case. 3 weeks we spent, 300,000 we spent. All of the hours that we put into investigating his alibi were not being used on tracking down the actual murderer, who by this time is making good their escape, concealing or destroying any evidence that might, they are effectively tidying up their potential link to the crime. We thought that would be good enough. We were pretty much gobsmacked when they got acquitted. And effectively, the judge's ruling was, well, you'd have had to have alibied him anyway. So you'd have had to have done all of those inquiries anyway. Well, that wasn't really the point. We could have done all of that on the first night.
Did it really set you back, Neil? I mean, how did it set you back in terms of the investigation itself?
Well, put it like this. When we found the person who'd actually murdered them, they had left London. And in the weeks that we were investigating this particular individual, that man was leaving London and was probably getting more and more nervous about being caught. So it's impossible to say. It's a sort of counterfactual as to whether, within 24 hours, the people who'd been doing all of the investigation into our prime suspect had been swiveled towards a different line of inquiry. It's impossible to say. Because, of course, we didn't get the street name of the actual killer for many, many months as a result of the media. Thank you very much, people who are involved in the media, for helping solve this crime. But we didn't get that key piece of information for a long time, so we didn't have anything to go on. But who knows? If we were still rattling doors and, the old expression is wearing out the shoe leather, doing old-fashioned policing, going door to door, speaking to witnesses, speaking to everyone who'd ever known Bertram, including many baby mothers. He was quite a Lothario in his time. So an awful lot of people who might have known something or might have led us in one direction. We'll never know that.
What about forensic evidence? I mean, people will think if a gun is fired twice in a very small space in that tiny bedsit, surely that gives you some forensic evidence.
Well, it gives you residue from the firing of the weapon.
It tells you about the gun.
But most importantly, you get the bullets back from the bodies. So the bodies are crime scenes in themselves. So we had bullets that we could compare to the National Ballistics Database, which basically takes any kind of weapon that's found and records it on the database, including its particular rifling. So you can forensically examine where bullets come from and which guns they're fired from. It takes bullets that are found at scenes and then tries to match them with other bullets to say that this is definitely from the same weapon. Zero hit on that as well. So no forensics from the scene, no forensic evidence from the bullets that tied them to the National Ballistics Database in the UK. I then went to Interpol, went to the ballistics database in The Hague, so looked at every European crime scene where bullets had been recovered or firearms used to see if there was any match to that. Absolutely nothing. So the answer is, good idea, Martin. We had the same idea. We didn't get anything from it.
This is why I'm a journalist and not a cop.
No, well, I don't know. You were following the same lines of inquiry that we were following.
And this story of this little girl, I have an image of her in my mind, 7 years old, shot dead in the back. It meant something to you, Neil, didn't it? I mean, you're a very human police officer in that I know how much you care, but this case did...
There's a lot of us about.
Yeah, there are a lot of you about.
But there's a lot
but
of
I
us
got to know you a little bit, and I've read your book and read some of the stories in there, including on this story as well. This story really started taking over your life, didn't it? And impacted as well on you and your family, the hours you were putting in to try and solve this case.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was a dreadful case. The worst of my Trident career. Clearly, counter-terrorism was an awful period of my career as well, but at the time, I was a lot younger then, a lot less resilient, I would say. I had kids of the same age. In fact, I didn't go to the actual post-mortem of Toni-Ann because one of my DIs knew that I had kids the same age as Toni-Ann and thought it wouldn't be right for me to go. So offered to go in my place. And I thanked him for that. He went. He never told me he had a daughter the same age as Toni-Ann. So I owe him a great deal from that. And Mark, if you're listening, thank you very much. It clearly shook him as well. Just looking at the photographs was bad enough. I can't imagine what it was like for him being there. But that has an immediate resonance. The violent, sudden death of a child is the worst thing any police officer ever deals with. It doesn't matter whether it's in a car accident or a murder. And there's lots of medical evidence on this. It's the thing that causes the most stress to a frontline officer. For a senior investigating officer, you have to deal with the family and the way her mother, I met her mother when she came over from the Caribbean. You've got to face a mother who's lost a 7-year-old child. There is nothing, worse than that. And I describe in the book I think her mother had done a lot of her crying by then. But I've been with other mothers who've lost their children, including one who was actually at the crime scene of her murdered child. And the sound of them crying was described to me as keening, which I didn't realise was an actual verb. And the wailing of a mother who's lost their child is the worst thing you could possibly hear. All of that is on your mind when you're thinking, I've got to, they'll never recover from this. For the rest of their life, they'll never recover. But the closest they'll ever get to recovery is if you put away the person who's done this, if you get them some sense of justice. And I've always thought that was our job, to try and get justice for victims. Doesn't matter whether it's a shoplifting or a murder, your job is to get justice for the victim. In these cases, it's all-consuming. So you spend all of your time. This might be me. Not every police officer feels the same way. But I found it impossible to compartmentalise my life between the job I was doing for Trident and the life I was living at home. So the way I describe it in the book is, and the way I've described it many times since, is police officers are often putting their family on hold for the families of complete strangers. So, effectively the number of us that have missed every major event in their child's life, every play, every sports day, every party, haven't been at friends' anniversaries, we've missed it all because we were busy doing this job on behalf of people who sometimes didn't care about us at all. But that's our job and that's what we were paid to do. But the trouble is, with it becoming all-consuming, you kind of, you forget that your loved ones are at home going through just as much stress, plus watching you go through stress and not being able to do anything about it. Because I found it impossible to talk to my wife. I couldn't talk to my children were tiny, at that time, babies. And My eldest would have been, during the 2 years we were investigating this, my eldest went from 1-year-old to 4 years old. So you're kind of thinking, there's no way they will ever understand what I was doing at the time. It was part of the reason for writing the book. It's why it's dedicated to the three of them to say, this is what your father was doing when he should have been your father. And I couldn't sit down with a wife who didn't know anything really about law enforcement. She married a cop, but she wasn't from that background, didn't know anyone else who was in that profession, didn't really have a close circle of friends jointly who were in that profession. She was just beginning to get that circle when I pretty much disappeared for years into Trident.
If you'd solved...
I feel very guilty about that whole thing. I think it's obvious in the book that I was not a good husband and father at that time.
If you'd solved this case early on as you thought you had, it could have been a real turning point. I mean, in your personal relationship, but also in terms of community relations with the police. The fact that you were seen for many months as having failed in this investigation, did that in some way reinforce that kind of cynical belief about policing and race in London? Did you sense that?
Yeah, lots of things to unpick there. And would it have been a turning point in my relationship? No, I had 16 other murders. I mean, the trouble with this murder is this one, I mean, for a while I was known as One Job Basu because this got so much publicity. People forget that SIOs don't just have one case at a time. And I've dealt with, as an SIO or an investigating officer, I've dealt with 22 murders in my career. And then obviously much later on in counter-terrorism, another 42 as the boss, if you like. I've got friends who spent their careers in murder investigation who've investigated. My best friend dealt with 88 murders. A number of other officers have dealt with over 100. It's kind of... My point about getting sucked into this life is this becomes your drug, not your family. This is what consumes you all of the time. And those SIOs who didn't solve a case, and I wasn't solving this one for a long time, it eats you up. It absolutely eats you up. I mean, I've still got 2 unsolved murders on my book. And both of those are kind of failures. You feel like a failure. So when you say, were people describing it as a failure, I don't think anyone actually ever said that to me. That's just the way me and my squad felt. This was our job to solve. And until you solve it, that's how you feel. And you're sort of self-flagellating about it, but that doesn't help. I don't think anyone in the community turned around and explicitly said to me, you're a failure because you haven't solved this case, because I was investigating others. And I think over the course of my career, me and the other 3 SIOs and all of the brilliant proactive teams who were going out all the time, trying to disrupt, violent criminals and trying to arrest people with guns before they could commit these horrific crimes, were getting a reputation for really helping out. So I always felt that we were beginning to turn the tide. But myself and my fellow SIO in North London, Julian Heaton, who taught me more about investigating Trident murders than any other single individual, may he rest in peace, so good at his job we named a building after him. So Julian Heaton House in his memory. He said very clearly that the trust and confidence we got from the community was from solving murders, was from putting away very bad people who were affecting the reputation of that community and corrupting their children. It was putting those people away for life. That's what won the trust and confidence. It wasn't the proactive teams who were kicking doors in and arresting people but not always getting a charge out of it. So they were disrupting a lot of gun crime. But quite often the criminal was walking free and they'd walk out into the community claiming they got one over on Trident. So it was getting the charges and getting the convictions and getting the years in prison that counted. And over the course of my sort of 4.5 years or so in Trident, we got much better at that. And that's what was winning them round.
As part of this investigation, naturally, you'd be putting a picture together of who Bertram Byfield was and what he was up to. What did his world look like when you were trying to form a picture of his life?
Well, he was really a very interesting character because he was born and raised in Jamaica. In a particular part of Jamaica in Kingston 11, which was a particularly violent part of Jamaica and became much more violent as years progressed, and the sort of the drugs epidemic that was in the United States, with the Caribbean being such a a nexus point for the importation of drugs from South America into the States. Jamaica got very violent. It was the murder capital of the world at one point, overtook Johannesburg, and he was born right in the middle of that. So the kids he grew up with, some of them had grown into some pretty fearsome cartel members, some of whom lived in the UK, one of which I had to go and interview in Worcester prison as to try and find more background about him, but of course also because I thought he might actually be responsible for the murder of Bertram Byfield. Bertram had an unpaid debt of about £10,000 that was owed to him, and he'd gone to the Caribbean, he'd gone back to Jamaica, and as part of his holiday, seeing his family, seeing his daughter, seeing Toni-Ann's baby mother, he'd been in Jamaica trying to collect that debt, and allegedly somebody had taken a shot at him. So there was clearly a potential motive or an opportunity out in Jamaica. And when you're investigating his Jamaican friends and you find out that they are some of the most feared people in the drugs trade from the Caribbean, you kind of think, well, it's obviously a cartel hit. It's obviously an international conspiracy to murder this man because he's involved with these people. That was one of many working hypotheses. So we had the prime suspect, we had this potential group of people who we didn't have enough information or intelligence to call them suspects, but they're what's called, until you're a suspect, you're a person of interest, which means you may have some knowledge of what's happened, you may be a significant witness to what's happened, or you may turn into a suspect because you have direct involvement. That's what this particular group were, who formed part of the 65 persons of interest that we were going to have to find, trace, interview and eliminate from the inquiry. And that's what we were doing in Worcester. And sitting across the table from that person was a bit of a career-defining experience, because you don't meet many people who are genuinely hard. My God, that was a man that you didn't want to wind up the wrong way.
What was he like?
Well, genuinely hard, and a man you didn't want to wind up the wrong way. But actually, it wasn't just me. My DI was an extremely experienced cop as well. We both interviewed him together, and we looked at each other afterwards and said, he isn't a suspect. He's one of Bertram's best friends. And he owed Bertram a great deal, who protected him when he was in Jamaica growing up. And his view, and he pretty much left us with, if you don't catch the person, I will. And you kind of knew what he was going to do to the person when he caught him. So there was a kind of almost an offer for help from somebody that serious in the criminal community that if he'd found out about it, we'd be the second person to know, the first person being the suspect.
So before you took up his offer of help,
I didn't take up his offer.
You did your own thing, of course. You made appeals. You tried to get the media to cover your appeals. I mean, I'd have thought that would be quite easy, given the nature of this murder. But you went to Crime Watch, which is obviously one of the best outlets for you for public appeals, and they turned you down. They wouldn't cover the story. And I suppose I've heard that from other police officers in the past, that they're bombarded with good causes, aren't they? So they can't cover every case.
Yeah.
So they turned you down. So that meant that you just didn't have any proper witnesses. Any witnesses at all?
No, well, I was pretty disgusted by the Crime Watch attitude. It was fed back to me. I actually asked the assistant commissioner at the time whether he would ring the editor and effectively bend the editor's arm and point out the fact that this was such a notorious case. And there was a bit of me, and maybe it was a bit of a chippy response, but there was something on my shoulder saying if this was a white kid, it would have been on Crime Watch in seconds. And the feedback I got from communications professionals, I'll never know whether this is absolutely true or not, but they'd had a conversation saying this is an entertainment show and no one's interested in the murder of black drug dealers. So in other words, black people killing black people wasn't entertainment. Goodness. And wouldn't get their viewers. I said, well, Toni-Ann wasn't a drug dealer. She's like 7, so I couldn't understand why that had happened. And it probably took, I can't remember how long it actually was. It was almost a year, maybe 9 or 10 months. And the editorial team had changed at Crime Watch, and they had seen the press. So what happened before that? Following the murder in September, there was a serious case review by local authorities about what on earth was Toni-Ann Byfield doing in Bertram Byfield's bedsit. when she was living in Birmingham with foster parents, how did she get to be there? It's a complicated story, but let's put it like this. It didn't cover the local authorities in glory that they had allowed this child to be with this person. Even though Bertram was a great dad and really loved Toni-Ann, that wasn't the issue. It wasn't abuse, but of course his lifestyle put her in great danger and eventually killed her. So as a result of that, there's a serious case review that takes place, and they have a press conference in spring the following year up in Birmingham with Birmingham Social Services, various people represented, and me, my boss and my DI, we go up there with Richard Davis to see what we can glean from that serious case review. And while we're there, my boss, Rick Turner, he leans over and he goes, I think we should do a press conference here. I went, we hadn't planned anything at all, but we couldn't believe the world's press had turned up for this serious case review press conference. So Rick went off to talk to a couple of people in the press pack saying, would you be interested in doing a press conference with me and the SIO on the case? Of course, you're an experienced crime journalist, Martin. You're not going to say no to that.
Absolutely not.
And what we didn't want to do was to take anything away from what was happening there. We didn't want to be associated with a serious crime review. That was important in its own way. So he said, well, we'll be in the hotel opposite. I think it was Richard or Andy went off to the hotel and said, have you got a private room we can use? And we just want to do some one-to-one interviews with the press. And they said, yeah, we'd be delighted to help you out. They were brilliant. They didn't realise that the entire press pack would go from, 200 metres up the road with all of their camera equipment and sat up in the hotel, completely closing off the foyer of the hotel. We had a little wooden chair, me and Rick sitting there with a little table in front of it. We were busy scribbling out a press release about what we were going to say, and we sort of look up, and I'm literally looking up and was just blinded by lights and cameras, and I don't know whether you or anybody you knew was there at the time, but it was probably my first or second big sort of piece of press in my entire career, not just on Trident. And I say to Rick, well, you're the boss, detective superintendent, you'll want to do this. He said, no, you'll be fine then. And I thought, well, this is a make or break moment in front of your boss. So I read my theory that this was potentially an international cartel hit it was potentially a theory at the time. We'd obviously lost our prime suspect. We had no other leads other than his background and what he did for a living. And so I put that out there as a witness appeal to see what we would get from that. And that was the first time we had been allowed that kind of level of publicity. And it was very lucky that we decided to take that opportunity at the time, because certainly our press teams had not been getting any offers to put more publicity out. We hadn't yet got a reward out. I don't think by then, I can't remember putting a reward out with that initial appeal. But what I think certainly from that, the change of editorial team at Crime Watch was kind of like, we'll feature this and we'll do a reconstruction. And when we get to the 12-month anniversary, we'll have the whole thing set up. So we were ready to do that along with the Peace March that took place.
I was going to say, it was called Not Another Drop, wasn't it? And the Peace March. Yes. And that marked the 1-year anniversary. And you decided to show up for that.
Well, I mean, I would have been a very strange kind of senior investigating officer if I hadn't, I think. Plus, we had something called the Trident Independent Advisory Group, who were going to be present at the march. With Cheryl Seeley, I think, was the vice chair at the time, later became the chair of that group. She was going to be laying a wreath there. And if nothing other than to pay my respects, we'd been to the funerals, and the funerals were incredibly moving. In fact, one of Bertram Byfield's daughters had chosen the piece of music by Luther Vandross called Dance With My Father Again, which was the Grammy Award-winning song of the year before. I'd never been able to get that out of my head. It's driven everyone I know absolutely insane, because I play it all of the time, because it reminds me of Toni-Ann and this particular case. And we'd been to all of that, and really we were there to pay our respects, but we're also there because it's the 12-month anniversary. It's a perfect time to make an appeal. We've now got Crime Watch set up. And of course, there may be people on that march who might want to speak to us. So you have to be there. You and your team have to be there.
And one of your senior commanders, Cressida Dick, also turned up.
She was my only commander at the time.
Okay, why was she there, to Bigfoot you?
No, she was commander. gangs and organised crime. If Bigfoot means to give me a hard time because I hadn't solved it yet, that's exactly what I thought. And I say in the book, at the time Cress's driver sort of pulled up alongside me and my DI. My DI is an ex-bodyguard from Special Branch back in the day, he was Douglas Hurd's bodyguard. He has an innate sense of when his principal might be at risk, and he was getting very nervous because this crowd is not pro-police. We haven't solved the crime. We've turned up at it. What do we think we're doing there? It wasn't the whole crowd. We had support in the crowd as well, but let's be honest, the majority of people there did not think Trident should be represented, let alone laying a wreath with Cheryl. And there's a photograph of me in a book by Graham McLagan called Guns and Gangs of Cheryl and I with the wreath, which I could never show my kids for many, many years because the next portfolio is 2 dead gangsters from Trident. So even as they were growing up and their mum was showing them a picture of what I did for a living, she showed me a picture of me and Cheryl standing there with a wreath, and she's got a hand over the other. So it was quite a big day, but I wasn't expecting any boss to turn up. I mean, people were wondering why we should be there. And she was in full uniform, which was a bit odd. It turns out she was coming from a commendation ceremony or some other kind of civic ceremony. And so she was in full uniform with the full white gloves and medals. And Cress is tiny, but of course when the car pulled up alongside us, we couldn't see her. All you could see was a big black stretch BMW with blacked out windows. And I think Andy was convinced I was about to be assassinated and that he was going to be taken down with me. So we were kind of a bit frozen. And then Cress gets out and she walks over, and I tell this story to lots of people because it's a story about leadership, because she had to tell her driver to go and park up because he was following us. I mean, she said to me, I said, hello, Mum. And she said, "Shall we have a walk, Neil? And don't call me Mum." She hates that. She's not royalty. She always wants to be called Cress, even though I'd never met her before. And we start walking, and I don't really remember anything she said on that walk, other than her going over to her driver and saying, "Stop following me, I'm fine, I'll come back when I'm ready." So we walk a little bit, and she obviously asked me a few things, but she's pretty much just asking me if I'm okay. And at the end of it, as she turns around to walk off, she holds my elbow and says, "We're all really proud of you." And it was a kind of weird thing because 3 weeks into the investigation a year before, her boss had been to see me at Hendon and had grilled me for over 2 hours on every lead, I didn't know why he was doing that at the time. I'd been told by his staff officer that he'd turn up, he'd put an arm around my shoulder, he'd probably take me out for a pint, and he'd just check that I was okay. No, he didn't. And he's a great hero of mine. His name was Bill Griffiths. He was Murder One. He was in charge of Homicide in London. And he was to prove a great hero in part 2 of this story. But he turned up to check on behalf of management board that I was match fit to lead this inquiry, because they knew I was the youngest SIO in the Met. They knew this was an incredible, notorious case. Should they leave it with me or not? And he turned up to check whether I knew anything about this case at all. And of course, for 2 hours, I gave him a forensic account of the investigation. And he walked away going, "This guy can do the job," and took that back to the commissioner, and I kept the job.
You could definitely do the job, but you still needed at this stage a break, didn't you?
Well,
and it took a while.
Nice.
It took a while to come. What happened, Neil?
Well, it was the Crime Watch appeal. So the same appeal that featured in their 25th anniversary programme on famous cases they solved, because in many respects they did. So I went on Crime Watch with the same appeal that I'd done with the case review back up in Birmingham, effectively saying we think this could be an international drugs cartel that has murdered Tony. And we got a couple of pieces of information in, one which was basically saying, "That Basu's an idiot, he doesn't know what he's doing." The classic sort of bumbling cops. You've come up with this ridiculous theory and it's nothing to do with that at all. And the second piece of information, which may well have been from the same person, but they were Crime Stoppers pieces of information. We had a major incident room going, and we had Crime Stoppers set up as well. And Crime Stoppers, if anyone's listening to this and ever knows something that they think the police need to know and are worried about phoning Crime Stoppers, do not be worried. It is properly anonymous. They wouldn't even tell me the sex of the caller, let alone what part of the country they'd come from or anything. It is properly anonymous, which is incredibly frustrating, because they gave me the street name of the killer. And they said, it's a guy called Kane. He's in Liverpool. And your theory, by the way, Mr. Basu, the other piece of intelligence, is absolute rubbish. Now, we thought with those two bits of information, we had one piece of intelligence sitting in our intelligence unit, which didn't really corroborate those two pieces, but was close enough to say there might be something in this. And while I'm on air, famous for losing my train of thought when Fiona Bruce leans in and says, "Don't worry, you'll be fine," because she can see I'm obviously massively nervous. It's my first appearance. And the clock's counting down behind her, 3, 2. Just as it's counting down, I said, "You shouldn't be nervous at all." I said, "How many people do you think are watching?" She said, 7 or 8 million. One, and we go live, and we're into the conversation. While I'm doing that, my DS is running down the intelligence that's coming in from Crime Stoppers on Kane, the street name. And of course, we get Kane, the street name. The street name is the street name of a guy called Joel Smith. Joel Smith is a Harlesden drug dealer who makes his living robbing other drug dealers. Kane's mother lives in Liverpool. So we're just going, oh God, that's it. That's the person. And there was, I can't describe it really, but, we must have had hundreds of years of policing experience on the squad, and everyone had the same tingling sensation that might be that trope of the kind of copper's sixth sense, the hunch, but everybody knew it was him. There was a point, I can't tell you how excited my detective sergeant in the intelligence unit was. In all his career, he hadn't had such what he thought was a solid make on an individual who would have committed this murder. And that was the Liverpool connection.
That sounds like a good point to finish episode 1, I think.
It does. Thank you so much for being so generous, Neil, not just with what you were doing on the case, but also, how it impacts at home and family-wise as well. It was such a heartbreaking case, wasn't it? A little 7-year-old, and obviously impacted you greatly. So thank you for sharing some of that with us as well.
Pleasure.
We'll leave episode 1 on that cliffhanger, a key turning point in the investigation and the hunt for Kane. It took Neil and his team from London to Liverpool, a city with its own violent drugs wars, loyalties, underground network and dangers. Neil will be back with Martin and I for our second episode, when we'll look at the surveillance, the arrest, the interviews, the moment Toni-Ann Byfield's killer talked himself into the dock. Welcome to our new Patreon followers. Thank you for joining. Just to remind listeners, if you want to hear the episodes ad-free, you can. Head over to patreon.com/True Criminals. Stay with us for 3 months at Patreon and we'll send you a free True Criminals mug. Your support means everything to us. If you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to leave us a review. It helps us grow, reach new listeners, and keep bringing you the stories you love. This episode is brought to you by Audio Bleach Global. Follow True Criminals on Instagram @true.criminals and on YouTube at youtube.com/@true-criminals. For exclusive content and ways to support the show, visit us at patreon.com/True Criminals. For partnership opportunities, please contact us at contact@audiobleachglobal.com.